The summer of 1941 tore across the Soviet frontier like a storm with no mercy. The Wehrmacht rolled eastward, tanks grinding through villages, skies streaked with the dive of Stukas. And amid that chaos, a single name carried a secret weight. Yakov Djugashvili, the eldest son of Joseph Stalin. Yakov was no hero by choice. He was a quiet artillery officer, a man who had lived most of his life in the shadow of a father who ruled an empire with iron and fear. To be Stalin's son was both a blessing and a curse, a bloodline of power, but also of unbearable expectations. In July, his battery was overrun near Vitebsk. Ammunition gone, surrounded, exhausted, he tried to rally his men, but German tanks closed in like predators. He had one pistol, one decision. Some said he tried to shoot himself. Others claimed he refused surrender until the last shell was fired. Either way, when the smoke cleared, the Germans found him crawling through a ditch, clutching his gun, but too weak to fight. His capture was a miracle for Hitler's propaganda machine. Stalin's own flesh and blood, now a prisoner of the Reich. Posters went up across Europe. "The son of Stalin is in our hands," they proclaimed. Goebbels' voice echoed on German radio, dripping with mockery. But in Moscow, silence. No announcement, no mourning, only the icy order from Stalin himself. Yakov surrendered. He should have shot himself. From that day forward, Yakov ceased to be a son. He became a stain. And somewhere in a German prison cell, beneath the heavy stone walls and the iron bars, Yakov sat alone, realizing that his father's empire was vast enough to crush even him. The Germans didn't need to torture Yakov Djugashvili. His greatest pain was already within him. When the guards dragged him into the Offizierslager 13D, a special camp for Soviet officers near Hammelburg, they didn't see a proud son of the Soviet Union, they saw a broken symbol. The commandant smiled coldly, knowing the value of the prisoner who now stood before him. Winter had locked Europe in its frozen jaws when the message came. A messenger from Berlin arrived at the camp with an envelope marked with the Black Eagle of the Reich. Inside lay an extraordinary proposal, one that would ripple through the world's capitals. Adolf Hitler himself had made the offer. The son of Joseph Stalin, held prisoner by Germany, could go home. In exchange, the Soviets would release Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the man who had commanded the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. For the Germans, it was perfect propaganda. A father reclaiming his son. What gesture could be more human, more humbling? And if Stalin refused, then the world would see what kind of man ruled the Soviet Union. When the offer reached Moscow through diplomatic channels, silence fell in the Kremlin war room. The air was thick, the generals avoiding eye contact as Stalin read the telegram. His pipe smoked slowly, a small gray cloud drifting above him. After a long pause, Stalin muttered, "They think they can shame me." Molotov dared to ask, "Comrade Stalin, what should we reply?" Spring crept slowly over Germany in 1943. The snow around Sachsenhausen camp melted into mud, and with it came the stench of sickness, rust, and despair. Among the thousands of prisoners, one man remained a silent enigma. Yakov Djugashvili, son of Stalin, prisoner number 28233. The guards had grown tired of him. He never begged, never spoke, never smiled. When they taunted him, he stared straight through them, as if looking into some other world. Even the Germans began to whisper that something haunted him. They moved him to a small compound within the camp, reserved for special prisoners, politicians, generals, and figures too valuable to be executed but too dangerous to release. His cell was bare, one cot, one window, one mind slowly unraveling. Each night, Yakov would stand by the electrified fence, staring at the coiled metal glowing faintly in the darkness. The hum of current filled the air like a whisper. Some said he talked to it, as if it were alive. One morning a fellow prisoner saw him sitting cross-legged in the mud, muttering in Russian. He said, "I should have shot myself. Maybe I'm just late." On April 14, 1943, as the guards changed shift, Yakov walked calmly toward the perimeter. Witnesses saw him stride across the yard, ignoring the shouted warnings. A spotlight caught his figure, tall, gaunt, but strangely peaceful. "Zurich, halt!" the sentry cried. He didn't stop. Some claimed he threw himself against the electrified wire, the voltage tearing through his body until he fell motionless. Others swore a guard shot him before he reached the fence. The official report read, "Prisoner Juzgashvili killed while attempting escape." But escape to where? When news reached the Kremlin, no announcement was made. Stalin said nothing. His aides watched him closely as he read the telegram. He set it down, stared into space for a long time, and finally whispered, he could not live without honor. Then he lit his pipe and never mentioned Yakov again. In that silence, the truth of both men became clear. One had died seeking freedom. The other had built a world that could never give it. And so between the wire and the watchtower, the line dividing father and son was burned away, replaced by the cold certainty of power. The dictator's eyes hardened. He tapped the ash from his pipe and said the words that would become legend. "I will not trade a soldier for a general." There was no emotion in his voice, no trace of the father, only the generalissimo, the man who commanded millions. The message was sent, and with that Yakov's fate was sealed. When the Germans told him his father's answer, Yakov said nothing. He simply looked away, jaw tight, eyes wet but unblinking. A witness recalled that he whispered one sentence in Russian, almost too softly to hear. "My father is the state. The state has no son." From that day forward, Yakov ceased to be speaking to anyone. He walked the camp grounds alone, head bowed, as if carrying an invisible weight. The guards called him Der Stumme Russe, the mute Russian. At night he sat by the barbed wire staring at the moon, his breath rising like smoke in the cold. Some said he prayed. Others said he simply waited, not for freedom, but for an ending worthy of his name. Because in a world where love was weakness and pride was power, Yakov Juzgashvili understood one terrible truth. He had been born not as a son, but as a symbol. And symbols were not meant to be saved. "You are Stalin's son, yeah?" he asked in a clipped accent. Yakov did not reply. He simply stared ahead, his uniform torn, his eyes hollow, his pride in ruins. Word spread quickly through the camp. The other Soviet prisoners whispered his name like a curse. Stalin's boy, the son who surrendered. Some spat when he passed. Others refused to eat near him. They all knew what surrender meant in Stalin's world. It wasn't survival. It was betrayal. One night a German officer approached him with an offer. "Write to your father. Tell him the truth about our humane treatment. You can end this madness." Yakov stared at the paper and pen on the table. His hands didn't move. Finally he whispered, "He will not answer." The officer laughed. "Then write anyway. The Führer will appreciate it." And so Yakov wrote, not a plea for freedom, but a message only his father could understand. A silent defiance in the form of obedience. But the letter never reached Moscow. It was shown instead to Hitler, who found it amusing. The propaganda began. Leaflets fell from German planes over Soviet lines. "Even Stalin's son has surrendered. Why die for a tyrant who won't save his own blood?" In Moscow, Those leaflets were burned by the truckload. Stalin's inner circle never dared mention Yakov's name. To do so was to invite suspicion, perhaps even death. Inside the camp, the days froze into each other. Yakov's body grew thinner, but his eyes remained sharp. He refused special food, refused German favors, refused to pose for photos. When guards mocked Stalin, he stood silent. When they offered freedom in exchange for cooperation, he refused again. But deep inside, something began to change. The defiance was still there, but so was despair. In the dark, he began to whisper to himself, not as a soldier, not as a son, but as a man forgotten by both sides. "Father, I am still alive. Do you even care?" The telegram reporting Yakov's death lay on Stalin's desk.
Spring 1943. The fields of Europe were drenched in blood. And yet, amid the thunder of artillery and the cries of dying men, a single proposal crossed enemy lines. Quiet, deliberate, and calculated. From Berlin came a message, carried through the channels of the Red Cross, addressed directly to the Kremlin. The Führer proposes an exchange. One German field marshal, Friedrich Paulus, for one Soviet prisoner, Yakov Jugashvili. Paulus was no ordinary man. He was the commander of the German Sixth Army, the one who had surrendered at Stalingrad, a humiliation that had broken the myth of Nazi invincibility. And Yakov, Stalin's eldest son, had been languishing in a German camp since 1941. The message was simple. A father could have his son back if he was willing to show the slightest trace of mercy. But the Kremlin was silent. When the proposal reached Stalin, his reply was cold, precise, and merciless. "I will not trade a field marshal for a lieutenant." Then, after a pause, he added words that froze the air in the room. "War is war." That was the end of it. The exchange was never considered again. Inside the German camp, news of the refusal trickled down to Yakov. He refused to believe it at first. The guards mocked him, showing him leaflets and broadcasts. "Your father doesn't want you, Yakov." But deep inside, he knew it was true. He had seen the way his father treated those who failed. Generals executed. Officers vanished into the night. Yakov's mind began to fracture. He stopped eating, stopped talking. The other prisoners said he would sit alone for hours, staring at the snow through the wire, murmuring under his breath, "My father, my father." The Germans tried to use him for propaganda. They took photos. They sent leaflets over Soviet lines. Even Stalin's son has surrendered. But Yakov refused to cooperate. Every photo, every interview attempt, he spat at them, cursed them, called them beasts. Even in captivity, he carried his father's pride, or perhaps his curse. Then came that final day, April 14, 1943, in the camp of Sachsenhausen. The guards' reports said Yakov had walked toward the barbed wire. The warning shots rang out, but he didn't stop. He walked faster. The machine gun opened fire. He fell. Tangled in the electric wire, his body burned, motionless. The Germans later claimed he had committed suicide by rushing the fence. But the truth was far more complicated. Some witnesses said he had shouted something before running, words lost in the chaos, maybe in Russian, maybe in despair. Others whispered that he had simply stopped caring. When news of his death reached Moscow, no one dared deliver it to Stalin directly. For 2 days, the telegram lay on his desk unopened. When he finally read it, he said nothing. No tears, no questions, just silence. Later, in a rare moment of honesty, one of his guards recalled Stalin muttering, "He could not stand being a prisoner, a true Jugashvili." But those who knew him best saw something change. For weeks, Stalin didn't smile. He stopped attending dinners. He spent long hours alone, staring at old photographs, one in particular, of a boy in a soldier's uniform smiling proudly beside him. And yet, the man who ruled an empire with iron and fear never once admitted to pain. He ordered that Yakov's name not be spoken again. His portrait was removed from the Kremlin walls. To history, Yakov simply disappeared. Years later, after the war, when the camps were liberated, Soviet officers found Yakov's name in the German records. Prisoner number 113. Beside it, one final note. Died attempting escape. Refused cooperation. For some, that was cowardice. For others, a kind of redemption. The son of Stalin, who had been abandoned by power, had chosen death on his own terms. Perhaps in that moment, Yakov Jugashvili found a freedom his father never would. And so, when people speak of Stalin's victories, the red flag over Berlin, the crushing of the Reich, they rarely mention the small grave in Sachsenhausen. No name, no ceremony, just ashes scattered in the wind. Because even the most powerful man in the world could not conquer the silence of his own heart. Power had won the war, but it had cost him his son.